Hi everyone, hope your preparation is going well. Today we'll be looking at a very important topic from the entrance point of view, also the interview point of view, because many questions are asked from this topic particularly, which is correlation. So most of us have been introduced to correlation in some form or the other, whether it is our college practicals or it is our own research. So today let's look at everything about correlation in detail. So we know that in statistics and research, there is something known as variables, right? One variable could be well-being, the other variable could be perfectionism, the other variable could be height, weight, and so on. And what do we do of these variables? Sometimes, if we want to assess and understand the relationship that exists between these variables, that is when we use this term called correlation. That is when we use this statistical tool called correlation. So now we know that correlation is a statistical tool which helps us to understand the strength of relationship between two or more variables in statistics and research. So let's take an example that I have two variables. One variable is anger, and the other variable is music. If I want to understand if there is any relationship that exists between both these variables, then one tool that I can use is correlation. So it is nothing but a statistical measure which helps us to find the relationship between these two or more variables. Now, when it comes to finding the relationship, we can assess the relationship upon different levels. One of the levels is the strength of the relationship, which means how strongly the variables are related to each other. And the other level that we can assess the relationship on is the direction in which they are related to each other. All right. And the final product that we come up with after doing the entire calculation is denoted by R, which is correlation coefficient. And another very important trick question that is asked in interviews is the values of R. So in statistics, the value of R can only range from -1 to +1. We'll be looking at what -1 denotes and what +1 denotes. But for now, it is important for you to know that जो value होती है correlation coefficient की, that can only range from -1 to +1. And between -1 to +1, all the values that are there, they can be taken by the correlation coefficient, and also 0 being one of them, because 0 comes between -1 to +1, right? तो इसके बीच में जितनी भी values होती है, that can be taken up by the correlation coefficient. We will understand how to interpret this value in the upcoming slides. So there can be different types of correlation that we will use depending upon the kind of data that we have. All right. So either we can have parametric or we can have non-parametric. So when we are working with parametrics, then we use Pearson correlation. On the other hand, sometimes we can also have non-parametric. So in those cases, we will not use Pearson. We will use Spearman's rank order correlation. All right, so this is something that you need to keep in mind. And when we use Pearson, we say that the value of R, the value of correlation coefficient is R. But at the same time, when we're using Spearman, then it becomes rho, which is denoted by this symbol that you see on the screen. So this is rho, which is used for non-parametric or skewed distributions. So skewed distributions, if you want to know how it looks like, it would look something like this, where the data is not evenly distributed like a normal probability curve. In the first case that you see, in this case, the data is normally distributed, and that is a case of parametric where we will use Pearson correlation. But in the second case, where the data is not evenly distributed, let's say the observations are clustered towards one extreme, then that is known as skewed distribution where we will be using Spearman. So another way of remembering is that S for skewed and S for Spearman. So these are small, small tricks that you can use to remember what kind of correlation test to use with what kind of data, what kind of distribution. Now, I hope this is clear. Let's go to the next slide and talk about some more concepts. So When we talk about correlation, there can be three different types. The first one being positive correlation, the other one being negative correlation, and the third one being no correlation or zero correlation. Now, let's start with what is positive correlation. Now, the term positive doesn't mean that, this is something good or this is something bad. And at the same time, the word negative correlation doesn't mean that the relationship is bad or negative. What positive actually means is that if one of the variables is increasing, the other variable will also increase, which means that both the variables are moving in the same direction. Because if the first one is increasing, if the first one is going up, the other one will also be increased and the other one will also go up. So do you see that they are being increased in the same direction? An example of this could be that the more number of MCQs that you solve, the more amount of confidence you will get in your preparation. And another tip here that, when it comes to solving MCQs, I would suggest that this is something you do with the process of your preparation and not something that you will leave towards the end. So use this tip for your preparation that the more number of MCQs you solve, the more your confidence would also be. So if one thing is increasing, the other will also increase. Now, there can also be a scenario that, when we're having a lazy day and we don't want to study, so I didn't solve any MCQs. So, when the number of MCQs I'm solving less, it is obvious that my confidence would also be less. Now, in this case, also, you see that both the variables are going in the same direction, both of them are being decreased. So, this is also a case of positive correlation. So positive correlation is nothing but when both the variables are moving in the same direction, whether both of them are increasing or both of them are decreasing. So that is positive correlation. Now there can be another type of correlation known as negative correlation, in which the relationship between both the variables is inverse, which means that they move in opposite directions. So let's say if one variable is increasing, the other will decrease. Okay, so there is a very common phenomena that students experience, which is stress, right? And we know that when stress increases in its intensity, then it leads to adverse effects. So let's say if your stress levels are very high, then ultimately there is a possibility that your performance would decline. So this is a case of negative correlation, that when one variable is increasing, the other will decrease. So how in positive correlation that we saw that if one is increasing, the other will also increase, or if one is decreasing, the other will also decrease. But in negative correlation, it is different because both of the variables have to be in opposite directions. So if my stress is increasing, my performance will decrease. So this is negative correlation. Another example of negative correlation could be that my stress levels are very low. I took part in some mindfulness activity, so now my stress levels are very low. So when my stress is low, obviously my performance would enhance. So this is also a case of negative correlation because the variables that are there, they are inverse, they are moving in opposite directions. Now, there can be a third possibility, which is known as no correlation or zero correlation. Sometimes there can be variables that are not related to each other at all. Okay, for example, my music preferences or my weight. So, like in layman's terms, also, you do understand that these are things that may not be related that much. So, if you randomly pick up any variable and if you try to test the strength of relationship, if you try to test the correlation between them, then there could be a possibility that there is no relationship only. So, that means that if one variable is increasing, then it does not have any effect on the other variable because they're not related only. So if my weight is increasing, then it may or may not have any impact on my music preference, right? So in such case, where there is no correlation, there is no relationship between the variables, whether or not one is increasing or decreasing, it doesn't have any effect on the other variable. It doesn't have any relationship with the other variable. And that is known as no correlation or zero correlation. Now you must have seen these graphs and you must be wondering what this is. So basically, this is how you represent correlation in a very diagrammatic way. And to represent correlation, we use something known as scatter plot. Now, this scatter plot will graphically represent the strength and the direction and the type of correlation between the variables. So in positive correlation, where both the variables are moving in the same direction, it would look something like this. And on the other hand, in negative correlation, when both of the variables are moving in opposite direction, then it would look something like this, as shown in the second graph. Since there is no relationship between the variables being studied in the third graph, you see that they are not following any linear fashion, they are not following any pattern, they are just scattered here and there. So you can see that these small crosses, they are just scattered here and they're not any linear fashion, which just, you can see in a second and tell that, okay, there is not much of any relationship between the variables. All right. Now, the dots that you see, either they can be clustered around a line and be represented in a very linear fashion like this, or there can also be times when the dots that you see, they are not that clustered near a line, but they can be scattered here and there also. So whether or not the dots are scattered here and there, or whether they are forming into a clear cut visible slanting line, tells us the strength of the relationship. So the more you see that the dots are forming a linear line, that indicates that the relationship is very strong, as we can see in the first two graphs. And in the last graph, as you can see, that the different dots are very scattered. That tells us that the relationship is weak because they are not forming any linear line. So you can see that they're scattered. That means that the relationship is very weak. Now, we were talking about the value of correlation coefficient that it ranges from -1 to +1. Let's see what they indicate and what they tell us about the strength of the relationship. So as you see in this slide, we can take values from -1 to +1. Now we know that +1 is something that tells us about a positive relationship. And -1 is something that tells us about the negative correlation or negative relationship, right? So the more the value of the correlation coefficient is closer to either of these ones, the more we get to know that the relationship is strong. Okay, so if my value of correlation coefficient is exactly +1, which is very rare to find, but the more closer it is to 0 0.8 or 0 0.9 or like 0.95, the more I understand that, okay, it is very strong relationship between the variables. So the closer it is to +1, then I would know that it is a very strong positive relationship. And on the other hand, similarly, the closer it is to -1, the more I know that, okay, the negative correlation is very strong, right? Now, there can be values like 0.4 or 0.45, which are not very close to either -1 or +1. It's somewhere in the middle. So that just tells us, ki, okay, there is a medium correlation. We cannot say for very sure that there is a very strong correlation. That only tells us that there is some sort of medium correlation between the variables. And similarly, the value of correlation coefficient can also be 0 or 0.1 or 0.2. And as we know that 0 is so far away from either of the ones, that means that the relationship is very weak. So this is a table that you can use to understand what the different values of correlation mean and what they indicate about the relationship. And I have seen multiple MCQs which would give these examples to you, and then you have to choose what is the strongest correlation. And this also reminds me of a question from CUET PG 2023, where they had given four correlation coefficients in the options, and we had to choose which one was the strongest one. So the options were something like 0.5, 0.8, -0.9, or 0.4. Now, as I've told you previously, that the closer it is to either of the ones, whether it is +1 or whether it is -1, the closer it is to either of the ones, the strongest it would be. So, as I gave you the options, the correlation coefficient, which was something like 0.9, that would be the correct answer because out of all the correlation coefficients, 0.9 is the closest to 1. So that is about our lecture on correlation. And I hope you have understood the concept and make sure to practice MCQs on this and also be clear with the concepts because there are questions which will be asked on this in interviews, especially in Christ, because research and statistics is a very important component of Christ interviews. And with this, I wish you all the best for your preparation.